A non sequitur is a logical fallacy that happens when the conclusion of an argument does not logically follow from the premises. This means that the conclusion does not make sense based on the evidence or statements that have been presented. For example, let's say that you date a lawyer who only talks about work. You might then conclude that all lawyers are boring. This is a non sequitur fallacy because the conclusion does not logically follow from the premise. Just because one lawyer is boring does not mean that all lawyers are boring. Another example of a non sequitur is if you have a bad experience with one man and then conclude that all men are abusive. This is also a non sequitur fallacy because the conclusion does not logically follow from the premise. Just because one man is abusive does not mean that all men are abusive. A non sequitur can also happen when the premises are not connected to each other at all. For example, let's say that you say, people like to walk on the beach. Beaches have sand. We should put sand on the floor in our living room. This is a non sequitur because the premises do not logically lead to the conclusion. The fact that people like to walk on the beach and that beaches have sand does not mean that we should put sand on the floor in our living room. Non sequiturs are often used in literature, comedy, and rhetoric to create humor or emphasize absurdity. Comedians often employ non sequiturs to surprise their audience with unexpected and illogical connections, leading to humorous or thought-provoking outcomes. Here is a more narrative way of explaining the non sequitur fallacy. Imagine that you are talking to your friend about your new boyfriend. You tell your friend that he is a lawyer and that all he ever talks about is work. Your friend might then say, lawyers are boring. This is a non sequitur fallacy because the conclusion does not logically follow from the premise. Just because your boyfriend is a lawyer and he only talks about work does not mean that all lawyers are boring. You could respond to your friend by saying, that's not fair. You can't just say that all lawyers are boring based on your experience with one lawyer. I'm sure there are plenty of lawyers who are interesting and fun to talk to. Your friend might then say, well, I've never met a lawyer who wasn't boring. This is still a non sequitur fallacy, because it is based on the assumption that because your friend has never met a lawyer who wasn't boring, then all lawyers must be boring. This is not a logical conclusion, because it is possible that your friend simply hasn't met enough lawyers to make a fair judgment. You could respond to your friend by saying, that's possible, but it's also possible that you just haven't met the right lawyers yet. There are millions of lawyers in the world, and I'm sure there are plenty of them who are interesting and fun to talk to. The non sequitur fallacy is a reminder that it is important to think critically about the conclusions that we draw from evidence. Just because something seems to be true based on our own personal experiences does not mean that it is actually true. It is important to consider all possibilities and to avoid making assumptions.